The night is quiet. A candle flickers on the edge of a wooden desk. Outside, a faint wind brushes through the old stone corridors of a medieval fortress. The sound is distant, soft, like the sigh of time itself. Tonight we travel back, far back, to an age when fear and faith walked side by side, when justice was often cruel and mercy was a rare whisper in the cold halls of power. The Middle Ages, an era of kings and crowns, of superstition and swords, and of death delivered not just by war, but by the hand of punishment. In those dim centuries, execution was not merely a sentence. It was a spectacle, a ritual, a warning written in blood and silence. Imagine the cobblestone squares at dawn, the damp air, heavy with the scent of iron and earth. Townsfolk gather slowly, wrapped in wool and rough linen. The baker, the blacksmith, the farmer, even children clutching their mother's skirts, each one drawn by the same morbid pull of curiosity and fear. For them, an execution is not horror, it is theater. The condemned waits in a small, dark cell. The walls are thick, cold, and damp. Somewhere far above, a bell tolls. Its echo travels through the narrow corridors, down into the bowels of the keep where the prisoner kneels. He has not slept. His hands tremble. His lips move in prayer, though he can no longer feel the warmth of belief. Outside, a priest murmurs Latin, his voice steady and distant, the rhythm of salvation offered to a man already forgotten by heaven. The guards enter. Their armor clinks softly, their faces blank, trained not to see. The prisoner is led up a narrow staircase, one step at a time. The stone is worn smooth by countless feet, each belonging once to a man who never returned. The air changes as he rises, from the stale chill of the dungeon to the faint scent of morning mist. The sky is gray, the kind of color that has no name, just a weight that presses against the eyes. As he steps into the open square, the murmur of the crowd swells like the sea. The scaffold stands in the center, a raised platform of rough timber, dark with age and with the stains of those who came before. The executioner waits beside it, silent, hooded, faceless. In his hand gleams the blade of an axe, its edge catching the thin sunlight. It is freshly sharpened. The air around it hums faintly, like a string pulled tight. But before we speak of the blade, let us step back, beyond this square, beyond this single man, to the heart of the medieval world, where death was both punishment and performance. In those times, justice was shaped by power, by the church, by fear. Crimes were often simple: theft, blasphemy, treason, heresy. Yet their punishments were crafted to reflect not merely guilt, but example. To kill a man was easy. To remind the living was the true purpose. Execution methods varied across lands and centuries, each with its own grim artistry. The gallows, the axe, the wheel, the pyre, all instruments of the same dark music. And though they differ in sound and shape, their rhythm was constant, suffering as a lesson, pain as spectacle, death as a sermon. One of the oldest and simplest methods was hanging. The gallows, often nothing more than a rough beam and a rope, stood at the edge of towns, always visible from the main road. A silent warning to all who entered. Order rules here, and defiance ends above the ground. The condemned would be led there at dawn, hands bound, eyes covered or left bare depending on mercy. Sometimes the rope was short, sometimes long. A short drop meant slow death, strangulation, minutes of desperate gasps and twitching limbs as the crowd watched in uneasy fascination. A long drop, more merciful perhaps, snapped the neck instantly, though mercy was rarely the point. As the body hung, swaying gently in the morning breeze, the crowd would slowly disperse. Mothers would pull their children close, whispering, "Obey." Merchants would return to their stalls, whispering prayers. The dead man became a lesson, his body left for days, a warning carved into the sky. In other cases, when the crime was of the gravest kind, treason or murder of a noble, the axe or sword would take its place. Beheading was seen as an honorable death, swift and clean. It was reserved for the privileged, for those whose blood carried status, even as it spilled. The executioner would practice his stroke, for a single clean cut was a matter of reputation. Too many blows, and he might face the crowd's fury. Yet history remembers that even this merciful death could turn clumsy. In one account from England, a noblewoman condemned for conspiracy knelt calmly before the block. The executioner trembled, perhaps from pity, perhaps fear, and missed his mark. The first strike tore through flesh but not bone. The second was worse. The third finally ended her suffering. The crowd turned away, murmuring prayers, but the sound of steel on bone lingered long after the body fell silent. There were methods darker still, born from superstition and the theater of pain. Burning at the stake, for instance, became synonymous with heresy, the crime of defying divine order. The condemned, tied upright to a wooden post, surrounded by kindling, would be given a final chance to confess. Some did, their voices trembling above the crackle of torches. Others remained silent, their eyes lifted skyward. The flames would start at the feet, slow and deliberate, curling upward in waves of heat and smoke. The crowd would step back, covering their mouths, the smell of burning flesh mixing with incense and ash. It was said that fire purified, that through pain the soul was cleansed. But in truth, it was a lesson of control, a reminder that thought itself was not free. Beyond the fire and rope lay even crueler devices, the wheel, the gibbet, the Iron Maiden. Each crafted not merely to kill, but to display suffering in stages. The breaking wheel, for example, was a massive wooden rim on which the condemned was tied. The executioner would then swing a heavy iron bar, methodically shattering each limb. It was not a single act of death, but a slow unmaking of the human form. Between blows, the crowd would murmur prayers or cheers, depending on the mood of the day. When the body was finally lifeless, it was left upon the wheel for birds and time to claim. Such brutality seems unimaginable now, yet to the medieval mind, it was order made visible. Every pain had purpose, every scream an echo of divine judgment. The Church taught that suffering could redeem the soul. Rulers believed it preserved their power, and the people, poor, weary, frightened, found strange comfort in watching justice unfold. It meant the world still made sense. That sin had a price. The executioner himself lived apart. Feared, avoided, yet essential. His house would often stand outside the city walls, near the gallows or the pit. Children would not look him in the eye. He could not enter the marketplace without silence falling around him. Yet when the time came, his presence was demanded, his blade, his hand, his precision. He was both servant and symbol, the hand of authority wrapped in shadow. Many drank heavily before their work. Some prayed, others detached themselves entirely. In the annals of Europe, few were named, but their legacy stains every page. In quieter moments, when the torches burned low and the crowd had gone, one might imagine the executioner cleaning his blade beneath the same moon that watched over saints and sinners alike. He might look at the blood, still warm upon the steel, and feel nothing, or perhaps too much. Through centuries, these methods changed only in form, not in purpose. Justice remained a mirror, reflecting not fairness but fear. And yet, there is a strange calm in studying this darkness from afar. It reminds us of how far we've come, and how close we still remain to that primal hunger for control, for order, for consequence. As the candle burns low on our table, and the medieval night drifts deeper, imagine again that small square of stone, the silent crowd, the cold breath of dawn, the whisper of rope over wood. The condemned kneels. The priest speaks softly. The executioner raises the blade. For a moment, all of time seems to hold its breath. Then, the sound, sharp, final, echoing across centuries. And the crowd exhales. Life continues. Bread is baked. Bells ring for prayer. The world moves on, indifferent to the one who has fallen. The Middle Ages were not only cruel, they were profoundly human. In their rituals of death, we glimpse not monsters, but mirrors. Fear, faith, the fragile need for meaning in a world that so often refused to grant it. And so, as the candle finally gutters and the room fills with stillness, remember that history does not sleep. It whispers. Sometimes it whispers in screams, sometimes in silence. Tonight, it whispers through the creak of a gallows rope, through the hiss of a dying flame. The past breathes softly, just beyond the edge of our dreams. Close your eyes now. The square is empty. The smoke has faded. The crowd has gone home. Only the wind remains, moving slowly over the stones where countless feet once stood. It carries no judgment, only the quiet truth of time. As dawn slowly fades into morning, the echoes of the previous day's executions still linger in the cold air. The streets of the town, once crowded with curious eyes and hushed murmurs, have emptied, leaving only footprints pressed into the damp earth, traces of human presence fading with each passing hour. The cobblestones, worn smooth by centuries of use, hold the memory of countless journeys, of merchants and peasants, of soldiers and thieves, and of the condemned, whose last steps were taken with trembling certainty toward inevitable ends. The castle gates creak softly as they swing with the wind, the wooden beams straining under the weight of age and time. Within the walls, shadows stretch across stone floors, lingering long after torches have been extinguished. It is here, in the quiet aftermath, that one may begin to understand the full scope of the medieval mind, the intricate, often grim, web of justice, faith, and fear that governed life and death alike. Consider for a moment the variety of executions carried out across Europe during the Middle Ages. Each region had its customs, each ruler his preferences, and each crime its prescribed punishment. In some towns, justice was swift and public. In others, it was prolonged, ritualized, a series of acts meant to instruct, warn, and terrify. The instruments themselves were often as elaborate as the sentences they delivered. The gallows, simple though it may seem, could be constructed with meticulous care, ensuring that the condemned would be displayed to maximum effect. The scaffold would be raised high, offering every spectator a clear view of the fate that awaited those who transgressed. In France, the breaking wheel, also known as the Catherine wheel, became infamous. Its design was both ingenious and horrifying. The condemned would be tied to the spokes of a large wooden wheel, limbs stretched and secured to prevent escape. The executioner, skilled and methodical, would then use a heavy iron bar to strike the prisoner's joints, breaking bones in a calculated sequence. This was not mere cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was a form of pedagogy. The suffering was intended to demonstrate the consequences of defying both divine and temporal law. The victim's screams would echo across the surrounding countryside, a grim lullaby for the obedient, and a stark warning for those who might contemplate rebellion. Yet even in these extreme measures, there was often room for ritual and, paradoxically, mercy. In some instances, the condemned were allowed a final word, a confession, or a prayer. They could be given wine to steady their nerves, a moment of peace before the storm of pain. The executioner might pause between strikes, allowing the victim a moment to breathe, a brief respite in the midst of suffering. It was a delicate balance, maintaining the spectacle for the public while managing the human element, the inevitable tension between death and the dignity of those about to face it. Fire, too, played a central role in the administration of medieval justice. Burning at the stake was often reserved for heretics, witches, and those accused of defying the church's authority. The method was both symbolic and terrifying. The condemned would be tied to a wooden post, often surrounded by bundles of kindling carefully arranged to ensure a controlled burn. The flames would be lit at the feet, rising slowly, consuming the body gradually, leaving the mind in the agonizing position of witnessing the slow inevitability of death. For the crowd, it was a lesson in obedience. For the church, a statement of divine power. And for the condemned, it was a moment suspended between life and the beyond, each second stretching into eternity. Across England and the Holy Roman Empire, execution methods varied not only by crime, but also by social status. Nobles accused of serious offenses might be beheaded with a sword, a method considered more honorable, swift, and precise. Commoners, however, faced harsher realities. Hanging, drawing, and quartering, a sentence reserved for the gravest crimes, such as high treason, was brutal and methodical. The condemned would first be hanged, nearly to the point of death, then disemboweled and dismembered, their limbs displayed as a permanent warning. The sight of the severed body parts, arranged meticulously along public roads, ensured that fear became a living lesson for all who passed by. The wheel, the stake, the axe, and the rope were more than tools. They were symbols, embodiments of authority and control. Yet their use was governed by a complex interplay of ritual, law, and superstition. Executioners were trained, often apprenticed from a young age, learning not only the mechanics of their craft, but also the psychological dimensions of their work. They had to balance efficiency with spectacle, cruelty with precision. Many executioners were socially ostracized, feared, and yet depended upon, living lives on the periphery of normal society. They were the quiet arbiters of mortality, their hands the instruments of the state's will. Even within the cell, the condemned's journey toward death was a narrative unto itself. Solitary confinement, dark and cold, was common. Prisoners awaited their fate in silence, the passage of time marked by the tolling of distant bells or the drip of water from stone ceilings. In some cases, they were allowed the comfort of a chaplain's visit, the whispered recitation of prayers, or a final meal. In others, they faced their end with nothing but the cold stones beneath them and the inevitable march toward the public spectacle. The psychological weight of anticipation was often as heavy as the punishment itself, a slow unraveling of the mind before the body met its fate. In the courts of Europe, records of executions reveal a meticulous attention to detail. Chroniclers would note the crime, the method of execution, and the public's reaction. These accounts, preserved in parchment and ink, provide a window into a world where law, faith, and fear intertwined so completely that death became a public dialogue. Through these narratives, one can almost hear the whispered prayers of the condemned, the soft murmur of the crowd, and the inexorable rhythm of history pressing forward. The instruments of execution themselves were often treated with a reverence bordering on ritual. Axes were polished, wheels oiled, ropes tested for strength and reliability. Executioners would perform their work with a precision born of practice and necessity. Mistakes could incite the crowd's anger, provoke riots, or reflect poorly on the authority that sanctioned the punishment. Each act was not merely a moment of death, but a carefully choreographed event, blending fear, spectacle, and social order. As we imagine these scenes, it is important to remember the human element, the condemned. The executioner, the priest, the crowd, each played a role in the theater of medieval justice, a system that balanced morality and power, mercy and terror. From the vantage point of centuries, there is a strange calm in observing these events, a recognition of the inevitability of mortality and the ways societies have sought to impose order upon it. Even as towns and cities evolved, as laws changed and methods became less brutal, the legacy of these executions remained embedded in culture and memory. The gallows, the wheel, and the stake became symbols, reminders of a time when the boundary between life and death was not merely personal, but public, a communal experience that shaped the consciousness of entire populations. Tonight, as the wind moves softly over the deserted town square, as shadows lengthen and fade under the faint light of the moon, one can almost hear the echoes of those who faced death centuries ago. The rope sways gently in the breeze, the wheel stands silent and empty, and the ashes of the pyres long cold. Yet in the silence there is a story, a whisper carried through time, of fear, of authority, of human resilience, and of the enduring quest to understand justice in a world ruled by power and belief. So, close your eyes. Let the whispers of the past settle softly around you. Feel the weight of centuries, the faint brush of history's hand, guiding you through the cold stones, the silent crowds, and the quiet lessons of mortality. And know that even in death, even in the most brutal of punishments, there is a rhythm, a soft, haunting cadence that reminds us of the fragile, transient nature of life and the enduring march of time. As the afternoon sun begins its slow descent behind the towering stone walls of medieval towns, the remnants of the day's punishments linger like shadows that refuse to dissipate. Streets that once carried the restless footsteps of spectators now echo only with the wind, stirring loose dust and whispers of the past. The air is heavy with memory, the invisible residue of fear, ritual, and consequence. If one listens carefully, the soft creak of wood from an abandoned scaffold seems almost alive, as if it remembers the weight of those who once knelt upon it. Consider for a moment the psychological landscape of execution in the Middle Ages. For the condemned, every step toward their fate was marked by ritual, isolation, and reflection. Solitary confinement, often in dark, damp cells beneath castle walls, was the first stage of their journey. Time itself was stretched deliberately so that anticipation might become a torment of the mind. In these cells, one could hear the distant echoes of town life, the murmurs of families, the clinking of pots, and the faint ringing of church bells. Yet the condemned remained separated, a living shadow, their fate sealed, but their senses heightened by the contrast between ordinary life and the inevitability of death. Punishments were carefully tailored, not only to fit the crime, but also to communicate a moral lesson. Theft, a crime that disrupted the fragile economic balance of towns, might result in hanging, a swift and public act designed to deter others. Blasphemy and heresy, crimes that challenged spiritual authority, invited fire, the flames symbolizing purification through suffering. Murder, treason, and rebellion carried the gravest penalties, often combining multiple methods to ensure maximum suffering and spectacle. These punishments were public in intent, but intimate in experience. The condemned, facing the eyes of the crowd, was laid bare in both body and spirit, forced to confront mortality under the scrutiny of society itself. One method, particularly feared across Europe, was the Iron Maiden, a device shrouded in both fact and legend. Though historical accuracy varies, the concept evokes a deeply human fear. The confinement of flesh within cold iron spikes, a slow and inexorable pressure against every nerve. Victims placed within such a device would face death gradually, the mind acutely aware of each piercing sensation, each slow, unavoidable compression. Even if the device was used rarely, the idea alone served to terrorize, a whispered warning of consequences for those who dared defy authority. In addition to these methods, the wheel and the breaking wheel maintained their fearsome reputation. The condemned would be tied, limbs splayed across wooden spokes, and struck with calculated precision to shatter bones without instant release from life. The wheel itself was a stage, the act a grim choreography of suffering. Once the process was complete, the body might be left upon the wheel for days, exposed to sun, wind, and birds, a constant, silent warning to passers-by. In some towns, multiple wheels were erected at crossroads, their silent occupants acting as permanent lessons for anyone who dared stray from the path of obedience. Beheading remained a stark contrast in its efficiency, though not without its own psychological weight. In France and England, for those of noble birth, the sword was both instrument and symbol. The condemned would kneel, head resting upon the block, often after receiving a final blessing or moment of prayer. The executioner's skill was paramount. A single swift stroke might grant a merciful death, while any hesitation could lead to repeated strikes, a gruesome spectacle that tested both patience and nerves of the observer. The body, once severed, would be laid to rest with varying degrees of ceremony, reflecting social status even in death. Fire, too, retained its symbolic power. Witches, heretics, and those accused of defying the church's laws were often subjected to burning at the stake. Bundles of kindling arranged carefully at the feet, the condemned might have a moment to speak, to confess, or to plead for forgiveness. Once the flames licked upward, the body would be consumed gradually, the smoke curling into the sky, a visible testament to divine authority and human compliance. Flames were not merely punishment. They were communication, both warning and purification, a visible echo of the invisible law. It is important, however, to consider the role of the executioner in this complex ritual. Far from being mere instruments of death, executioners were often skilled professionals who navigated a delicate balance of precision, ritual, and psychological control. They trained for years, learning the mechanics of their craft as well as the timing necessary to maintain order and respect among witnesses. Many were socially marginalized, living on the edge of society, yet their work was indispensable. Their hands delivered the sentence of the law, yet they also carried the weight of centuries of tradition, belief, and human expectation. The condemned, too, were often prepared for their fate through religious or psychological intervention. Priests might visit the cells, offering last rites, comfort, or warnings of the consequences in the afterlife. Confessions were sought, prayers whispered, and in some cases, small tokens or messages were allowed. These moments were brief, yet they reveal the interplay of fear, hope, and ritual that defined the Middle Ages. Each execution was both an end and a lesson, a final act of theater that intertwined the physical, spiritual, and social realms. As the day drifts toward evening, imagine the quiet aftermath. The streets are empty, the scaffold stands abandoned, its wood still warm from the sun, its rope swaying gently in the wind. The wheel lies silent at the crossroads, empty yet echoing with memories of countless victims. The pyres have cooled, ashes scattered by breeze. The crowd has gone home, yet the lessons of mortality, obedience, and consequence remain etched into the stones, the air, and the collective consciousness of the town. In reflecting upon these events, one may recognize that the Middle Ages were not solely defined by cruelty, but by an intricate system of order, belief, and control. Justice, as brutal as it often was, functioned within a moral and social framework that sought to preserve hierarchy and stability. The methods of execution, varied and meticulous, mirrored the complexities of human society, revealing the inseparable connection between law, culture, and the human psyche. Even as centuries passed, and laws evolved, and more humane practices replaced the most brutal, the legacy of these executions endured in memory, art, and literature. They became symbols, reminders of the fragility of life, the consequences of actions, and the enduring power of societal structures. In some ways, the memory of these punishments is quieter than the events themselves, yet no less powerful, whispering across time to remind us of both human cruelty and resilience. As night approaches, close your eyes once more. Picture the empty town square under the silver glow of the moon. Feel the gentle sway of the rope, the stillness of the wheel, the faint scent of ashes on the breeze. Imagine the echo of the past not as terror, but as history speaking softly through time, guiding, reminding, and lingering quietly in the spaces between the stones. The Middle Ages, in all their complexity and severity, remind us that life and death, punishment and mercy, were entwined in ways that continue to fascinate, horrify, and teach. And in this quiet reflection, the shadows of history settle softly, allowing the mind to drift, carried gently by the cadence of time, into the silent, unbroken rhythm of centuries past. The evening settles slowly over the medieval town, the fading light casting long, soft shadows across the cobblestones. The quiet is profound, disturbed only by the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant clatter of an owl landing upon the tower ledge. The air carries the faint chill of approaching night, and with it comes the memory of countless acts of judgment performed in these very streets. Each stone, each corner, each empty square seems to remember the footsteps of the condemned, the measured pace of the executioner, and the silent gaze of townspeople who once gathered to witness the unfolding of life's most final moments. In the Middle Ages, execution was both a spectacle and a structured ritual, deeply entwined with the cultural and religious beliefs of the time. It was a societal event designed not only to punish but also to instruct. The methods, though often brutal, reflected a careful balance of legal authority, moral lesson, and theatrical presentation. Each detail mattered, from the type of crime to the social status of the condemned, from the chosen instrument of death to the precise arrangement of witnesses. In many ways, the act of execution was as much about the living as it was about the dying, a lesson carved into the psyche of the community as surely as it was etched into the flesh of the condemned. Among the most feared punishments was hanging, simple in concept but terrifying in execution. The gallows, typically constructed in central squares or at the entrance to towns, stood as a silent warning to anyone who might consider transgressing the law. The condemned would be brought forth, their hands bound, perhaps blindfolded, their eyes averted or left to witness their own fate. The drop could be short, resulting in a slow strangulation, or calculated to snap the neck instantly. Regardless of the method, the act was always public, designed to resonate with every onlooker, leaving an indelible impression of the consequences of crime. Beyond hanging, the breaking wheel, also called the Catherine wheel, was infamous for its methodical cruelty. Victims were tied to the spokes of a large wooden wheel, their limbs stretched taut and immobile. The executioner would strike with a heavy iron bar, breaking bones in a sequence intended to maximize both suffering and visibility. This was not an act of random cruelty, but a performance of authority, a deliberate demonstration of the power of law and the consequences of defiance. The wheel was then often erected in a prominent location, leaving the body exposed to the elements. A perpetual reminder that justice, once meted, was absolute. Fire, too, played a significant role in medieval punishments. Burning at the stake was frequently reserved for those accused of heresy, witchcraft, or rebellion against the church. The condemned, tied upright to a wooden post surrounded by carefully arranged kindling, faced the flames as both punishment and symbolic purification. Before the flames were lit, a final opportunity for confession or repentance was sometimes offered. Then the fire would rise from the feet, climbing slowly, consuming the body in a controlled, agonizing process. The crowd would watch from a distance, the rising smoke forming a visible testament to the authority of both law and faith. Beheading, considered a more honorable death, was often reserved for nobility. In this case, precision was paramount. The condemned would kneel at the block, receiving blessings or last rites, their head resting upon polished wood. The executioner, experienced and practiced, would deliver a swift stroke with a sword, severing life from body in an instant. Yet even this method required preparation, ritual, and attention to detail, reflecting the intersection of respect, social status, and the performance of justice. In some towns, execution became an elaborate theatrical display. Multiple methods could be combined to heighten both fear and moral instruction. A thief might be hanged first, then displayed, while a heretic could face the dual spectacle of breaking and burning. These rituals were not designed for entertainment in the modern sense, but rather to communicate lessons of obedience, morality, and divine or temporal authority. The citizens who witnessed these acts absorbed them as social instruction, their minds shaped by repeated exposure to the consequences of defiance. The role of the executioner was both specialized and socially complex. Skilled in the mechanics of death and the timing of spectacle, executioners often trained for years, learning not only the physical techniques required for their craft, but also the psychological aspects of managing both condemned and crowd. They were simultaneously feared and necessary, living on the margins of society, carrying out tasks that no one else could perform. Despite their expertise, they were often shunned, their work a reminder of the thin line between life and death, order and chaos. Prisons and dungeons themselves contributed to the psychological landscape of execution. The condemned spent days or weeks in solitary confinement, in darkness and damp, isolated from normal human contact. The anticipation of death weighed heavily as every moment passed with the faint sounds of life continuing outside. Prisoners might hear distant bells, the clatter of carts, the murmur of prayers. Yet they remained suspended in a liminal space between life and death. The mind, forced into reflection, often faced its own torments, magnified by the knowledge of the approaching spectacle. In many cases, executions were meticulously documented by scribes, chroniclers, and clerics. These records noted the crime, the method of punishment, the response of the crowd, and sometimes the last words of the condemned. Such documents provide insight into the medieval understanding of law, morality, and human behavior. They reveal a world in which suffering was public, death was instructional, and the line between justice and terror was intentionally blurred. The instruments themselves were treated with care and respect. Axes were sharpened, ropes tested, wheels maintained, and pyres meticulously arranged. Executioners approached their work with a blend of skill, ritual, and detachment, aware that a mistake could provoke anger, incite unrest, or diminish the perceived authority of the law. Each execution was a carefully staged event, balancing efficiency, spectacle, and the psychological impact on both condemned and observer. Even centuries later, the echoes of these acts persist. The empty squares, abandoned gallows, and silent wheels serve as reminders of the intensity and severity of medieval justice. They teach us about human fear, authority, and resilience, and about the ways societies have sought to impose order through ritualized punishment. The memory of these practices is a complex mix of horror, fascination, and reflection, a reminder of the fragility of life, the inevitability of mortality, and the enduring presence of human imagination in both justice and cruelty. As night deepens, the town settles into stillness. The air grows cooler, carrying faint scents of wood smoke and damp stone. Shadows lengthen, stretching over squares once filled with onlookers and the condemned. The rope sways faintly in the breeze. The wheel stands silent at the crossroads. The ashes of pyres rest undisturbed. These are the remnants of history, not just of acts committed, but of lessons delivered, absorbed, and carried forward by generations. Closing your eyes, imagine the gentle sway of the gallows rope, the quiet creak of the wheel, and the faint glimmer of embers from a long-extinguished pyre. Feel the presence of centuries around you, the slow, rhythmic heartbeat of history itself, teaching not through terror alone, but through reflection, memory, and the gentle passage of time. The Middle Ages, in all their severity, are a reminder of the complex interplay of justice, fear, and human society. And as the night carries its soft, silent whispers, let yourself drift among the shadows, cradled by the weight of history, carried gently into the quiet rhythm of the past. The night deepens slowly over the medieval town, enveloping its stone streets and narrow alleys in a soft, velvety darkness. The flickering glow of torches, long extinguished leaves, only faint shadows, stretching over walls and cobblestones as if history itself has been imprinted into the very stones. There is a profound stillness now, interrupted only by the occasional whisper of wind brushing against the towers and the distant hoot of an owl surveying its quiet dominion. In this silence, one can almost hear the echoes of the condemned. Footsteps once hurried, chains once clinking, and voices once raised in despair, prayer, or defiance. These echoes are faint, ethereal, like whispers of time itself, carrying the weight of centuries of justice, fear, and ritual. The condemned, whose lives we have been tracing through these preceding scenes, occupy an ambiguous space between memory and presence. In the Middle Ages, the journey toward execution was not simply physical, but profoundly psychological. The period leading up to death was characterized by isolation, ritual, and reflection, and the ways in which a prisoner confronted their fate were shaped both by law and belief. Solitary confinement was often the first step, a prolonged period in which the condemned would confront the inevitability of their mortality. In cold, damp cells beneath thick stone walls, time stretched and distorted. The distant clatter of carts, the murmur of prayers, and the faint tolling of bells punctuated the stillness outside, while the prisoner's own heartbeat echoed like a drum within. The mind became both a prison and a theater, rehearsing the arrival of the final act long before the public execution commenced. Execution in the Middle Ages was a carefully constructed performance. The methods varied widely across Europe, reflecting regional practices, social hierarchy, and religious imperatives. Hanging, the most ubiquitous form of public execution, was simple in principle but complex in its psychological effect. The gallows, often erected at crossroads or in the central square, were visible symbols of law and consequence. The condemned might face a short drop, resulting in a slow strangulation that could last minutes, each gasp and convulsion observed by a silent, watchful crowd. Alternatively, a calculated long drop could break the neck swiftly, offering a more immediate end, yet still leaving an indelible impression on those who watched. In all cases, hanging served as a stark reminder that law and order were maintained through the ultimate exercise of authority, control over life and death. Yet hanging was but one element of a much broader array of methods. The breaking wheel, with its careful choreography of bone-shattering strikes, exemplified the medieval obsession with structured suffering. Victims were tied to wooden wheels, limbs outstretched and secured, each joint a target for the executioner's methodical blows. The purpose was not only punishment, but also demonstration, a message broadcast in physical agony to anyone who might dare transgress societal norms. Once the act was complete, the wheel was often displayed prominently, leaving the body exposed to the elements as a living warning to the public. Birds, wind, and sun would gradually consume the remnants, yet the lesson, carefully calculated, endured. Fire, in its dual roles of punishment and purification, remained a powerful symbol. Burning at the stake was primarily reserved for those accused of heresy, witchcraft, or rebellion against religious authority. The condemned were tied to wooden posts, surrounded by carefully arranged kindling. They were sometimes given a final opportunity to confess or repent, their voices rising over the crackle of torches, trembling with fear or defiance. Once ignited, the flames consumed slowly, progressing from the feet upward, offering a prolonged, agonizing passage between life and death. The sight, the smell, and the sounds of fire at work were all deliberate components of the spectacle, designed to communicate divine authority and the serious consequences of moral or religious transgression. Beheading, though reserved for nobility or those of higher social standing, required precision and ritual. The condemned would kneel at the block, sometimes receiving blessings or final counsel, while the executioner prepared the sword or axe with careful attention. A single swift strike was the ideal, reflecting both skill and respect for status. Mistakes could result in multiple strikes, each one a harrowing reminder of the frailty of human execution and the very public consequences of failure. Even in its efficiency, beheading was not merely a method of death, but a performance, a moment in which social hierarchy, ritual, and justice intersected. Some towns combined multiple execution methods to emphasize severity and moral instruction. A traitor might first be hanged, then disemboweled, then displayed on a wheel, each act reinforcing the finality and seriousness of their crime. These acts were meticulously planned and executed with attention to timing, audience, and outcome. The crowd, gathered to witness, absorbed these lessons both consciously and subconsciously, internalizing social and moral norms through observation of pain, order, and consequence. The executioner, a central figure in this complex ritual, was both feared and necessary. Trained extensively in technique, timing, and psychological management, executioners operated on the margins of society. Feared by commoners yet indispensable to the authorities, their role was to carry out death with precision, maintaining order and ensuring that the intended lesson of each execution was delivered fully. Many executioners were social outcasts, yet their work made them vital participants in the functioning of medieval justice. Their expertise extended beyond mere mechanics. They were masters of timing, ritual, and perception, carefully calibrating each act to balance terror, spectacle, and procedural integrity. The psychological impact on the condemned was profound. Days or weeks of isolation allowed anticipation to amplify fear, imagination to conjure every possible outcome, and the mind to oscillate between despair, prayer, and fleeting hope. These moments of suspense were often as punishing as the execution itself. In some cases, spiritual guidance or clerical intervention attempted to provide solace, yet the certainty of the impending public event overshadowed any comfort. Every breath, every sound of the distant town, every clink of chain or bell intensified the tension, creating a liminal space where life and death coexisted uneasily. Chroniclers, scribes, and clerics documented executions meticulously. Records included details of crime, punishment, method, crowd reaction, and often the final words of the condemned. These accounts provide modern historians with insights into medieval society, revealing the interconnectedness of law, faith, ritual, and social control. The written word preserved not only facts, but also the moral, cultural, and emotional weight of the execution. They serve as echoes, whispering the complex tapestry of human behavior, belief, and governance across centuries. In reflecting on these methods, one can see the symbolic weight of the instruments themselves. The axe, the rope, the wheel, and the pyre were more than tools. They were manifestations of authority and morality, tangible reminders of society's values and limitations. Their presence in public spaces communicated power, obedience, and consequence. They conveyed lessons without words, teaching through sight, sound, and the subtle rhythm of death and ritual. Even as the night deepens, the memory of these acts persists. The empty scaffold, the abandoned wheel, the cold stones of the town square, they all carry traces of lives once lived, of fear confronted, and of societal order maintained. The faint scent of ash, the creak of aged wood, and the whisper of wind through narrow alleys evoke a quiet meditation on mortality, justice, and the human experience of time itself. As one closes their eyes and imagines the medieval town under the cover of darkness, the lessons of history unfold softly. The condemned's path, the executioner's precision, the crowd's silent absorption, all converge into a rhythmic narrative of fear, faith, and order. There is a strange serenity in this reflection, a gentle cadence of the past, allowing the mind to drift slowly, to absorb the weight of centuries, and to feel the subtle pulse of history as it continues, uninterrupted, into the quiet night. The Middle Ages, with all their severity and ritual, offer not only a record of punishment, but also an understanding of the human condition. The methods of execution, whether by rope, fire, wheel, or blade, reveal the depth of societal concern for order, the interplay of fear and morality, and the fragile nature of life itself. In the quiet, when no eyes are watching, and the town sleeps beneath a moonlit sky, the echoes of these lessons settle softly, leaving behind a whispering rhythm of reflection, learning, and the enduring passage of time. The moon hangs low over the medieval town, casting a silver hue across the stone walls, narrow alleys, and empty squares where life has long since receded into quiet. The air is cool, tinged with the faint scent of damp earth, smoke from long extinguished fires, and the residual memories of human presence. Though the town is silent now, history itself seems to breathe through the stones, whispering the weight of centuries of law, ritual, and mortality. Each corner, each shadowed doorway, seems to carry the memory of those who walked its paths. Condemned or executioner, witness or priest, all participants in a system that defined life, death, and morality in ways both brutal and precise. Execution in the Middle Ages was never a simple act. It was the culmination of a societal structure, a ritual that reflected not only the punishment of an individual, but also the reinforcement of communal norms and divine authority. Hanging, for example, while conceptually straightforward, carried profound symbolic and psychological weight. The gallows, erected in the heart of towns, served as a constant visual reminder of the consequences of disobedience. The condemned, whether blindfolded or left to observe, would step onto the platform, feeling the coarse rope in their hands, the rough wood beneath their feet, and the tension in the air as the crowd held its breath. The drop, whether short or calculated to break the neck, was the final stage in a process that had already stretched weeks or months into anticipation, fear, and reflection. The breaking wheel, or Catherine wheel, represents one of the most methodical and ritualized forms of execution. The condemned would be tied in precise positions, limbs splayed and immobilized, each joint prepared for calculated strikes from the executioner's iron bar. The blows themselves followed a sequence intended to maximize pain while prolonging consciousness. The wheel was then elevated or displayed, leaving the body exposed to the elements and the gaze of the public. Birds, sun, and wind would gradually claim what remained, but the lesson endured, imprinted in the minds of all who witnessed it. This was punishment as both a physical and social instrument, designed to teach, to warn, and to reinforce authority. Fire, one of the most visually and psychologically intense methods, was particularly reserved for heretics, witches, or those accused of religious defiance. Burning at the stake involved a careful choreography, the condemned tied upright, kindling arranged at the base, and a final opportunity to confess or pray. Flames would rise slowly, consuming the body from feet to head, transforming the act into a dramatic visual lesson of divine judgment and temporal authority. The crowd, watching from a careful distance, absorbed both the terror and the moral lesson intended by the ritual. In many ways, fire was the ultimate communicator, speaking without words to both observer and condemned. Beheading, reserved for nobility, was a form of execution that combined efficiency, ritual, and social hierarchy. The condemned would kneel at the block, head resting upon polished wood, sometimes receiving blessings or final counsel. The executioner's skill was crucial. A single, precise strike could end life instantly, while hesitation could necessitate multiple blows, each witnessed and recorded by the assembled crowd. Beheading demonstrated the nuanced intersection of power, ritual, and social order, where even the act of death was governed by hierarchy and symbolism. The combination of methods for particularly severe crimes created a layered narrative of suffering and instruction. A traitor might be hanged, disemboweled, and displayed on a wheel. A heretic might be burned after prolonged confinement and ritualized admonishment. The sequence of acts, their public nature, and the visible suffering were intended to impress upon the populace the gravity of moral and legal transgression. It was not merely punishment, but a vivid lesson, encoded into the fabric of daily life. Executioners themselves occupied a unique social position. Skilled in both the mechanics of death and the management of public perception, they operated on the margins of medieval society, simultaneously feared, shunned, and indispensable. Their training was extensive, covering the physical precision required for each method, the psychological awareness necessary to control both condemned and crowd, and the ritualistic elements that ensured each execution fulfilled its intended social function. Despite their expertise, executioners were socially ostracized, living apart from ordinary communities while performing duties essential to the maintenance of law and order. The psychological toll on the condemned cannot be overstated. Days or weeks of isolation, silence, and anticipation created a mental environment in which the inevitability of death became a constant presence. Sounds from the outside world, bells, footsteps, murmured prayers, contrasted sharply with the prisoner's solitude, amplifying fear and reflection. Spiritual counsel or clerical intervention could offer comfort, yet the certainty of impending public spectacle remained inescapable. Each moment was elongated, a liminal space suspended between life and death, where mind and body were held in tension. Chroniclers of the period recorded these acts in meticulous detail, noting the crime, method of execution, crowd reaction, and often the last words of the condemned. These records provide insight into medieval society, revealing how justice, ritual, and public spectacle were intertwined. They offer a lens through which modern observers can understand not only the severity of medieval punishments, but also the social and psychological structures underpinning them. Execution was both a literal and symbolic act, conveying moral, religious, and political authority in ways that words alone could not. The instruments themselves, axes, ropes, wheels, and stakes, were treated with deliberate care. Axes were sharpened, ropes tested for reliability, wheels constructed and maintained, pyres carefully arranged. Each act demanded preparation, precision, and ritual, for mistakes could provoke anger, undermine authority, or diminish the intended moral lesson. Execution was as much about perception and social order as it was about the individual condemned. The mechanics of death were inseparable from the choreography of public morality. The social and cultural implications extended beyond the moment of execution. Empty scaffolds, abandoned wheels, and silent town squares retained traces of past events. Even long after the last witness departed, the physical and psychological markers of punishment lingered, shaping communal memory and reinforcing societal norms. The faint smell of ash, the subtle sway of a rope in the wind, and the creak of timber all contributed to a landscape imbued with historical memory, carrying lessons of mortality, obedience, and consequence. As the night deepens, one can imagine the town in quiet reflection. The condemned's path, the executioner's careful hand, the observing crowd, all converge into a narrative of human experience shaped by fear, morality, and authority. The Middle Ages were not defined solely by cruelty. They were a complex interplay of societal order, ritualized justice, and deeply held beliefs. Through the lens of execution, we glimpse both the brutality and the humanity of a society striving to maintain coherence in an often chaotic world. In the stillness of the medieval night, the echoes of centuries past settle softly. Shadows stretch over empty squares. Stones retain the memory of countless footsteps, and the faint traces of smoke, wind, and whispered prayers linger. It is here, in the quiet, that history speaks most clearly, not through spectacle, but through reflection, memory, and the subtle rhythm of time. The condemned, the executioner, and the townspeople are all part of a continuum, a shared narrative in which life, death, and morality are intertwined in ways that continue to fascinate and instruct. As the town rests under the silver moonlight, one may sense the delicate balance that governed medieval life: fear and ritual, justice and authority, suffering and reflection. These elements, woven together, created a world in which each act of punishment carried meaning far beyond the individual. The weight of centuries presses softly against the stones, guiding the imagination through shadowed alleys, empty squares, and the lingering echoes of humanity confronting its own mortality. Here, in this quiet contemplation, the Middle Ages speak not only of death, but also of resilience, of order, and of the enduring human effort to impose meaning on the fragile, transient nature of life. The instruments of execution, the rituals, the silence, and the memories all converge into a slow, hypnotic cadence, a rhythm that carries the observer gently into reflection and perhaps into sleep. The pale light of the early dawn begins to creep over the horizon, brushing the medieval town with soft, muted colors. The cobblestones glisten faintly from the night's dew, each stone carrying the silent memory of countless footsteps: merchants, children, nobles, priests, thieves, and the condemned. The wind moves quietly through the narrow alleys, rustling the loose thatch of roofs, swaying the ancient trees in the town square, and whispering through empty corridors of castles and prisons alike. In this quiet, one can almost sense the pulse of the past, a rhythm forged by centuries of human lives, choices, and consequences, lingering just beneath the surface of the present moment. Execution in the Middle Ages was far more than a simple administration of justice. It was a ritualized, social, and psychological phenomenon that touched every layer of society. The condemned, isolated in cold, damp cells for days or weeks, faced not only the inevitability of death, but also the psychological weight of anticipation. Their cells were often dark, illuminated only by narrow slits or flickering candlelight, the air thick with moisture and the lingering odors of stone, smoke, and human occupation. Every sound from the outside world, the tolling of distant bells, the shuffle of feet along cobblestones, or the faint murmur of prayers, carried amplified significance, magnifying anxiety, reflection, and the consciousness of the self suspended between life and death. Hanging was the most common form of public execution, yet it carried a variety of subtleties and nuances. The gallows, meticulously constructed in central squares or at crossroads, stood as visible emblems of authority. The condemned would ascend the platform, the rough rope pressing against wrists and ankles, their bodies tense with fear and anticipation. The drop might be short, leading to slow strangulation, each convulsion and gasp recorded vividly by witnesses or calculated precisely to snap the neck instantly. Regardless of method, hanging communicated a potent message. Law, authority, and consequence were inseparable, and life could be taken by the state at any moment. Among the most notorious methods was the breaking wheel, or Catherine wheel. Victims were tied with precision, limbs stretched across the wheel's spokes. The executioner struck methodically with iron bars, breaking bones in sequences designed to prolong suffering while ensuring the victim remained conscious for as long as possible. The act was both punishment and lesson, each strike a reminder to onlookers that disobedience carried consequences severe and unyielding. The wheel was often displayed for days, the body left to the elements, birds, and insects, a macabre, lingering testament to the power of the law and the fragility of human life. Bedtime, too, served both as punishment and symbolic purification. Burning at the stake was a punishment reserved for heretics, witches, and rebels against religious authority. The condemned would be tied upright to a post, kindling arranged carefully at their feet. They might be offered a final opportunity to confess or pray, their voices trembling as flames licked upward. The crowd would watch from a distance, absorbing the terror, moral lesson, and religious symbolism of the act. Flames communicated authority without words, turning the spectacle into a meditation on obedience, divine judgment, and the ephemeral nature of human life. Beheading, often reserved for nobles, required both precision and ritual. The condemned knelt at a block, head resting upon polished wood, receiving blessings or counsel from priests. The executioner's skill was paramount. A single, swift strike ensured a merciful end, while hesitation could necessitate repeated blows, prolonging suffering and increasing tension among witnesses. Beheading symbolized social hierarchy, ritual, and justice in a single act, emphasizing the structured order that permeated medieval life. Some crimes warranted a combination of execution methods to emphasize severity and instruct the populace. A traitor might first be hanged, then disemboweled, then displayed on a wheel. A heretic might endure prolonged confinement before being burned at the stake. Each act was carefully choreographed to convey moral, social, and political lessons, reinforcing obedience, deterrence, and societal cohesion. The careful sequencing of punishments reflected a sophisticated understanding of human psychology, community perception, and the performative aspect of law. The executioner's role was simultaneously technical and symbolic. Skilled in mechanics, timing, and crowd management, executioners were socially marginalized, yet essential. They navigated the fine line between cruelty and order, balancing precision, ritual, and audience psychology. Their training included both physical skill and an awareness of social expectations, ensuring that every execution fulfilled its intended moral and instructive purpose. Despite fear and ostracization, they were central figures in maintaining societal equilibrium, the arbiters of mortality within a carefully structured legal framework. The condemned's psychological journey was profound. Anticipation, isolation, reflection, and fear combined to create a unique mental state in which every sound, sight, and sensation from the surrounding world carried amplified significance. Priests might offer spiritual guidance or counsel, yet the certainty of the impending spectacle overshadowed comfort. Days stretched into weeks, and the mind occupied itself with memories, regrets, prayers, and fleeting thoughts of hope. Each moment became a rehearsal for the final act, a slow, deliberate approach toward mortality observed by an ever-present society. Medieval chroniclers recorded these events with meticulous detail. They documented crimes, punishments, methods, and crowd reactions, sometimes noting the final words of the condemned. These records provide invaluable insights into the structure of medieval society, revealing the interconnectedness of law, morality, ritual, and communal experience. Execution was both a literal act and a symbolic lesson, teaching obedience, reinforcing authority, and conveying moral and religious principles through observation, ritual, and spectacle. The instruments of execution themselves, axes, ropes, wheels, and stakes, were treated with careful preparation. Axes were sharpened, ropes tested, wheels maintained, and pyres arranged for maximum effect. The success of the execution depended not only on the method, but also on timing, audience management, and social expectation. Mistakes could provoke unrest, undermine authority, or diminish the lesson intended by the ritual. Execution was therefore a combination of technical skill, psychological understanding, and theatrical presentation, balancing terror, morality, and order. The societal and cultural impact of execution extended beyond the act itself. Empty scaffolds, abandoned wheels, and silent town squares retain the memory of past events, influencing communal behavior, reinforcing moral codes, and shaping collective consciousness. The faint scent of ash, the sway of ropes in the wind, the creak of timber, all contributed to a landscape imbued with historical and psychological resonance. Even long after the last witnesses departed, the memory of punishment persisted, affecting perceptions, beliefs, and social cohesion. As the first rays of morning light illuminate the town, one can imagine the layered experiences of those involved. The condemned awaiting fate, the executioner poised to act, the crowd observing silently, and the clerics offering counsel. Each participant contributes to a complex, ritualized narrative in which life, death, law, and morality converge. The Middle Ages were defined not solely by cruelty, but by an intricate system of social, religious, and psychological order in which execution served as both punishment and instruction, personal loss and public lesson. In this quiet reflection, the instruments and rituals of execution take on a meditative quality. The wheel, the rope, the axe, the pyre, all exist not only as tools of death, but as symbols, carriers of moral, legal, and societal meaning. The rhythm of preparation, execution, and aftermath forms a cadence through time, a slow pulse connecting centuries of human behavior, belief, and consequence. Shadows stretch across empty squares. Stones remember the footsteps of the condemned, and the faint traces of smoke, wind, and whispered prayers linger, offering a hypnotic meditation on mortality, justice, and human society. And as the town awakens to the new day, the echoes of centuries of law and punishment remain, soft but persistent. The lessons of mortality, obedience, and social order, encoded in the architecture, rituals, and memories of execution, continue to whisper through the ages. They are reminders not only of human cruelty, but also of the enduring desire for structure, meaning, and moral clarity within a complex and fragile existence. The Middle Ages, with all their rigor, fear, and ritual, remain a tapestry of human experience, a slow, enduring rhythm that carries us gently through time, inviting contemplation, reflection, and ultimately, the soft surrender to the cadence of history itself. The first light of dawn creeps slowly across the medieval town, brushing the tops of weathered rooftops and the edges of narrow cobblestone streets with a soft, golden glow. The air is crisp and cool, carrying the faint, lingering sense of smoke from long-extinguished fires, damp earth from the night's dew, and the subtle, almost imperceptible aroma of human presence etched into centuries-old stones. The town is quiet, yet the silence itself hums with the memory of countless lives, choices, and consequences that have unfolded here. Every corner, every alleyway, every abandoned scaffold seems to vibrate with the echo of footsteps, whispers, and murmurs from centuries past, as though the very air remembers the actions and decisions of those who walked these streets before. Execution in the Middle Ages was never merely a technical procedure. It was a profound, ritualized experience that combined law, morality, psychology, and public spectacle. For the condemned, the journey toward death began long before the public act itself. Days, sometimes weeks, of solitary confinement in dark, damp cells created a psychological crucible in which anticipation, fear, reflection, and regret mingled. The faint sounds of life from beyond the walls, the tolling of bells, the footsteps of passers-by, the murmur of prayers were amplified, transforming each distant noise into a symbol of both normalcy and the inevitable separation from it. The mind of the condemned became a theater, rehearsing the final act repeatedly, where each moment stretched into eternity and each sound carried profound meaning. Hanging, the most common form of execution, was a practice that blended simplicity and psychological complexity. Gallows, often erected in town squares or at busy crossroads, stood as permanent, visible reminders of the power of law. The condemned would ascend the platform, feeling the rough rope bite into their skin, the coarse texture of wood under their feet, and the tension of the moment pressing in from all sides. The drop might be short, resulting in slow strangulation that allowed observers to witness the struggle for life, or precisely calculated to break the neck and end life immediately. In either case, hanging was more than a physical punishment. It was a symbolic lesson to the populace, demonstrating the inescapable reach of justice. Among the most infamous methods of execution was the breaking wheel. The condemned would be secured across the spokes of a large wooden wheel, their limbs carefully positioned to maximize both visibility and suffering. The executioner struck with deliberate precision, breaking bones in sequences designed to prolong awareness and pain. Once completed, the body was often displayed on the wheel, left to the elements, birds, and insects, transforming the site into a macabre but instructive monument to law and consequence. The act was as much about the education of witnesses as it was about the punishment of the individual, embedding societal lessons within the fabric of public consciousness. Fire, as a method of execution, held both literal and symbolic power. Burning at the stake was reserved for those accused of heresy, witchcraft, or rebellion against religious authority. The condemned were tied upright to wooden posts, surrounded by kindling carefully arranged to control the progression of flames. A final opportunity to confess or pray might be granted, the voice trembling as fire slowly consumed flesh. The crowd absorbed both the terror and the moral lesson, observing divine authority in action. Fire communicated a lesson beyond words, demonstrating power, consequence, and the potential for purification, intertwining physical suffering with symbolic meaning. Beheading, often employed for nobles, was a method that required precision, ritual, and respect for social hierarchy. The condemned knelt at a block, head resting upon polished wood, receiving blessings or counsel from priests. The executioner's skill was critical. A single, swift stroke could bring a merciful death, while hesitation might necessitate repeated strikes, prolonging suffering and testing the composure of the observers. Beheading reflected social structures, ritualized respect, and the careful balancing of justice, authority, and spectacle. Some severe crimes required multiple methods to convey their gravity fully. A traitor might be hanged, disemboweled, and then displayed on a wheel, while a heretic could endure prolonged confinement before being burned. Each act was choreographed to communicate moral, legal, and religious principles, reinforcing obedience, deterring transgression, and strengthening communal cohesion. The sequencing of punishments was deliberately structured, demonstrating an acute awareness of human psychology and social perception. Executioners themselves occupied a paradoxical social role. They were feared and shunned, yet indispensable. Their training was both technical and psychological, encompassing the mechanics of each method, crowd management, and the ritualistic components of public executions. Executioners needed to balance cruelty and order, precision and spectacle, ensuring that each act served its intended purpose. Despite societal ostracization, they were central to maintaining stability, serving as both enforcers and symbols of authority. The condemned's psychological experience was complex and profound. Extended isolation and anticipation intensified fear and reflection, creating a liminal space where every sound and sensation assumed amplified significance. Clerics or priests might offer counsel or prayers, yet the certainty of the impending public spectacle dominated the mind. Days could feel like weeks and minutes like hours, as the prisoner rehearsed their final moments repeatedly, preparing for a performance of mortality witnessed by the entire community. Chroniclers and scribes meticulously recorded these events, noting the crime, method of execution, audience reaction, and even the last words of the condemned. These records provide modern historians with insight into medieval society, revealing the intricate connections between law, ritual, morality, and public spectacle. Execution was both a literal and symbolic act, designed to instruct, deter, and reinforce societal and religious norms through observation, ritual, and consequence. The instruments of execution, axes, ropes, wheels, stakes, and pyres, were maintained with great care. Axes were sharpened, ropes tested, wheels repaired, and pyres arranged for maximum effect. Success depended not only on method, but also on timing, audience management, and social expectation. A poorly executed punishment could undermine authority or diminish the intended moral lesson. Execution was therefore as much about psychology and performance as it was about physical mortality. The societal impact extended far beyond the moment of execution. Abandoned scaffolds, silent wheels, and empty squares retained traces of past events, influencing communal behavior and moral codes. The faint scent of ash, the subtle creak of ropes swaying in the wind, and the gentle murmurs of distant bells imbued the environment with the memory of suffering, reflection, and societal order. Even when no eyes observed, history lingered, shaping perceptions and embedding lessons into collective consciousness. As morning light fills the town, one can imagine the various roles converging: the condemned awaiting fate, the executioner poised to act, the crowd silent with attention, and clerics offering counsel. Each participant contributes to a narrative of social, moral, and psychological interplay, where life and death, obedience and consequence, punishment and instruction intertwine. The Middle Ages were not defined solely by cruelty. They were characterized by an intricate system of order, ritual, and social cohesion, with execution serving as both a personal and communal lesson. In this quiet reflection, instruments and rituals of execution take on meditative qualities. The wheel, the rope, the axe, and the pyre exist as symbols, carriers of moral, social, and spiritual meaning. The cadence of preparation, execution, and aftermath forms a slow rhythm, connecting generations across centuries. Shadows stretch over cobblestones, stones retain the impressions of footsteps, and the faint traces of wind, smoke, and whispered prayers linger, creating a hypnotic meditation on mortality, justice, and human society. As the town stirs, the echoes of law and punishment remain, subtle yet persistent. Lessons of obedience, morality, and consequence, encoded in ritual, architecture, and memory, continue to whisper through time. They are reminders of human fragility, social order, and the enduring desire to impose structure and meaning on life. The Middle Ages, with their fear, ritual, and hierarchy, form a tapestry of human experience, a rhythm that carries gently through history, inviting contemplation, reflection, and the quiet surrender to the cadence of the past. The town awakens slowly under a pale, silvery dawn, the first light of day stretching across the cobbled streets and timbered houses with a delicate, muted glow. The air is crisp and carries the lingering fragrance of dew-soaked earth, faint smoke from extinguished torches, and the subtle scent of stone and wood aged by centuries. The quiet is deep yet alive, filled with the ghosts of countless footsteps and murmured voices, resonating through narrow alleys, empty squares, and abandoned scaffolds. In this stillness, the town seems suspended between centuries, a living museum of history where the shadows of the condemned, the executioner, and the observing crowd merge with the whispers of time itself. Execution in the Middle Ages was not simply an act of punishment. It was a complex ritual that reflected the society's deepest concerns about morality, obedience, justice, and divine authority. The condemned were removed from the rhythms of ordinary life long before the final act. Days or even weeks of confinement in dark, damp cells shaped their minds, producing intense anticipation, reflection, and psychological torment. Every sound from the outside, the tolling of bells, the shuffle of carts, the faint prayers murmured by passers-by, was amplified, each noise becoming a symbol of the world continuing without them. This prolonged preparation, the liminal space between life and execution, heightened both fear and reflection, allowing the condemned to confront their mortality in profound ways. Hanging, while common, was a method laden with both practical and symbolic significance. The gallows, often erected in town centers or at prominent crossroads, stood as monuments to law, authority, and societal consequence. The condemned would climb the platform, hands bound, body tense, feeling the coarse rope against their skin and the solid, unforgiving wood beneath their feet. The drop could be short, causing slow strangulation and visible suffering, or carefully calculated to break the neck instantly, ending life in a single stroke. In either case, the act conveyed a powerful lesson to the observing public. The law's reach was absolute, and defiance carried irrevocable consequences. The breaking wheel, known also as the Catherine wheel, was among the most notorious instruments of punishment. The condemned were tied carefully to the spokes, their limbs positioned to maximize visibility and prolong pain. The executioner struck with methodical precision, shattering bones in a calculated sequence designed to maintain consciousness as long as possible. Following the act, the body was often displayed for days, exposed to the sun, wind, and birds, a grim yet instructive monument to law and consequence. Witnesses absorbed lessons of morality, obedience, and fear imprinted in memory through the slow, deliberate spectacle of suffering. Becky, as a method of execution, carried both literal and symbolic weight. Reserved for heretics, witches, or rebels against religious authority, burning at the stake was a ritualistic act designed to communicate moral and divine consequences. The condemned would be tied upright to wooden posts, kindling arranged strategically around them. A final opportunity to confess or pray might be granted, their voice trembling as the flames rose from their feet, consuming flesh gradually. The crowd observed in silence or awe, witnessing divine authority enacted in a tangible fiery form. The visual, auditory, and olfactory aspects of fire intensified the lesson, leaving a lasting impression on all who watched. Beheading, a method often reserved for nobles, required precision, skill, and adherence to ritual. The condemned knelt at a polished block, receiving blessings or final counsel, while the executioner prepared the blade. A single swift strike could end life instantaneously, while hesitation might necessitate repeated blows, prolonging the act and intensifying tension. Beheading reflected social hierarchy and ritualized respect, balancing justice and spectacle in a performance that reinforced societal norms. Certain crimes required multi-stage punishments to convey their gravity fully. A traitor might first be hanged, then disemboweled and displayed on a wheel. A heretic might endure prolonged imprisonment before facing fire. Each step was carefully choreographed to teach moral, legal, and religious lessons, reinforcing obedience and social cohesion. The sequencing of punishments demonstrated an acute awareness of human psychology, public perception, and the performative aspects of justice. Executioners themselves occupied a paradoxical social role. They were feared, often ostracized, yet indispensable. Their training encompassed both technical skill and psychological acuity, covering the mechanics of each method, management of spectators, and adherence to ritual. Executioners maintained order and ensured that each act conveyed its intended moral, societal, and spiritual lessons. Despite their isolation from everyday life, they were central to enforcing law and authority, embodying both fear and necessity within the medieval justice system. The psychological experience of the condemned was profound. Isolation and anticipation intensified fear and reflection, creating a liminal space in which every sound, touch, and movement carried significance. Clerics and priests might offer counsel or comfort, yet the certainty of the impending spectacle dominated consciousness. Days could feel like weeks, and minutes like hours, as the prisoner rehearsed every moment, visualized the crowd's reactions, and confronted the fragility of life. This prolonged psychological preparation was a form of punishment itself, intertwined with the physical methods to create a comprehensive, multi-layered experience of mortality. Chroniclers and scribes meticulously documented these acts. They recorded crimes, methods of execution, public reactions, and even the last words of the condemned. These records provide modern historians with insight into medieval society, revealing the intersection of law, ritual, morality, and public spectacle. Execution was a physical, moral, and psychological event designed to instruct, deter, and reinforce societal and religious norms. The written accounts preserved not only facts but the moral, emotional, and cultural weight of these events, ensuring their lessons endured across generations. The instruments of execution, the wheel, the rope, the axe, the pyre, were maintained with careful attention. Axes were sharpened, ropes tested, wheels repaired, and pyres arranged for maximum effect. The success of an execution depended not only on method, but also on timing, audience management, and social expectation. A poorly conducted act could undermine authority, provoke unrest, or diminish the intended moral lesson. Execution was therefore a combination of technical skill, psychology, and performance, balancing terror, instruction, and order. Societal and cultural impacts extended far beyond the execution itself. Empty scaffolds, silent wheels, and abandoned squares retained the imprint of past acts, influencing behavior, reinforcing moral codes, and shaping collective memory. The faint scent of ash, the sway of ropes in the wind, and the subtle echoes of bells contributed to an environment imbued with historical and psychological resonance. Even without observers, these elements carried moral and societal lessons forward, embedding themselves in the consciousness of the community. As the morning light bathes the town, the convergence of roles, condemned, executioner, spectators, and clergy, forms a rich, ritualized narrative. Life and death, obedience and consequence, punishment and instruction intertwine, creating a layered, complex experience that defines the social, moral, and spiritual landscape of the Middle Ages. Execution was not mere cruelty. It was an essential mechanism for reinforcing societal order, moral codes, and religious belief, performed with precision and conscious awareness of psychological and communal effect. In quiet reflection, the instruments and rituals of execution take on meditative qualities. The wheel, rope, axe, and pyre exist not merely as tools, but as symbols, carriers of moral, social, and spiritual meaning. The cadence of preparation, execution, and aftermath forms a slow rhythm connecting generations across centuries. Shadows stretch over cobblestones, stones retain impressions of countless footsteps, and faint traces of wind, smoke, and whispered prayers linger, creating a hypnotic meditation on mortality, justice, and human experience. The echoes of law and punishment persist even as the town awakens. Lessons of obedience, morality, and consequence, encoded in ritual, architecture, and memory, continue to resonate. They are reminders of human fragility, social order, and the enduring desire to impose structure and meaning on existence. The Middle Ages, with their fear, ritual, and hierarchy, form a living tapestry of experience, a rhythm that flows through history, inviting contemplation, reflection, and the gentle surrender to the cadence of the past. And in this quiet, suspended between memory and imagination, one can almost hear the whispers of the condemned, the measured step of the executioner, and the silent attention of centuries of witnesses, forming a rhythm that guides the mind gently through the shadows of history and into the soft, reflective embrace of understanding, peace, and rest. The sun rises slowly over the medieval town, casting a soft golden glow across weathered stone walls, narrow alleyways, and the familiar cobblestone streets that have carried centuries of footsteps. Morning light touches the scaffolds, wheels, and other remnants of the execution rituals that have long since been abandoned. Yet their memory lingers in the air, as palpable as the dew that glistens on the stones. The town is quiet, the usual bustle absent, leaving only the soft whispers of the wind and the distant crow of roosters. In this silence, the weight of history is felt most keenly, a rhythm that moves like a slow pulse through time, binding the present to the lives, fears, and rituals of the past. Execution in the Middle Ages was far more than a simple application of law. It was a performance, a ritualized passage through which society communicated moral, legal, and spiritual authority. The condemned, isolated in stone cells for days, weeks, or even months, were subjected to the profound psychological tension of anticipation. Each moment of confinement amplified every sound, sight, and scent, heightening awareness and reflection. The distant tolling of bells, the shuffle of carts along cobblestones, and the murmur of prayers carried meaning beyond their immediate sound. Time itself seemed to stretch and distort, creating a liminal space where life and death coexisted in uneasy proximity, shaping both mind and body in preparation for the final act. Hanging, the most ubiquitous method, was deceptively simple yet fraught with symbolic and psychological complexity. The gallows, prominently placed in town squares or at crossroads, served as visual reminders of authority, obedience, and consequence. The condemned would ascend the platform, their wrists and ankles bound, the rough rope pressing against their skin, the coarse wood beneath their feet, grounding them in the reality of the moment. The drop could be short, leading to slow strangulation and prolonged suffering, or precisely calculated to break the neck instantly. In either case, the act served as a vivid lesson for the assembled populace. Disobedience was met with swift and undeniable consequence. Among the most notorious instruments of punishment was the breaking wheel, or Catherine wheel. The condemned were secured across the spokes, limbs stretched and bound to ensure both visibility and prolonged suffering. The executioner struck with meticulous precision, shattering bones in a deliberate sequence designed to prolong consciousness. The body was often displayed publicly for days, exposed to the elements, birds, and insects, creating a grim but instructive monument to justice. Witnesses absorbed the lessons encoded in the spectacle, internalizing the consequences of moral or social transgression through observation of pain, order, and authority. Fire, particularly burning at the stake, combined literal and symbolic punishment. Reserved for heretics, witches, or rebels against ecclesiastical authority, it was a ritual designed to demonstrate moral and divine consequences. The condemned were tied upright to wooden posts, kindling arranged carefully at their feet. They might be offered a final chance to confess or pray as the flames rose from their feet, consuming flesh gradually. The crowd, observing from a distance, absorbed terror, moral instruction, and the weight of divine judgment. Fire spoke in a language beyond words, transforming physical agony into a lesson of spiritual, moral, and social authority. Beheading, used primarily for nobles, combined precision, ritual, and social symbolism. The condemned knelt at the polished block, receiving counsel and blessings from priests. The executioner's skill was paramount. A single swift stroke ensured an immediate death, while hesitation could necessitate multiple blows, prolonging suffering and intensifying the collective tension. Beheading represented hierarchy, justice, and ritualized order in one coordinated act, underscoring the complex social structures of medieval life. Certain severe crimes required multi-stage executions. A traitor might first be hanged, then disemboweled, and finally displayed on a wheel. A heretic might endure weeks of imprisonment before facing fire. These sequences were carefully orchestrated, balancing punishment, education, and moral instruction. Each act was designed to reinforce obedience, demonstrate authority, and maintain social cohesion. The choreography of death, as gruesome as it was, reflected a profound understanding of psychology, communal perception, and ritualized symbolism. Executioners occupied a unique and paradoxical position within society. Feared and often socially ostracized, they were nonetheless essential. Their expertise encompassed technical precision, crowd management, psychological understanding, and ritual observance. Executioners had to ensure that every act conveyed the intended moral, legal, and spiritual lesson. Despite social marginalization, they were indispensable for maintaining societal order, performing a role that required both skill and a keen awareness of human perception and collective psychology. The condemned psychological journey was perhaps the most profound aspect of medieval execution. Isolation, anticipation, and reflection created a state of heightened consciousness. Every sound, smell, and movement became loaded with meaning. Clerics offered spiritual guidance, but the certainty of the public spectacle remained inescapable. Time seemed to elongate unnaturally as prisoners visualized the act, rehearsed their responses, and confronted the fragility of life. The psychological component of execution was itself a form of punishment, inseparable from the physical methods employed. Chroniclers and scribes documented every detail meticulously. Crimes, punishments, crowd reactions, and the final words of the condemned were recorded for posterity. These chronicles provide modern historians with a window into medieval society, revealing the intertwining of law, ritual, morality, and public spectacle. Execution was both a physical and symbolic act, a mechanism through which communities internalized social norms, ethical expectations, and spiritual authority. The written record preserved not just facts, but the weight of societal conscience and the moral cadence of the time. The instruments of execution, axes. Ropes, wheels, and pyres were maintained with meticulous attention. Axes were sharpened, ropes tested, wheels repaired, and pyres carefully constructed. The effectiveness of an execution depended not only on method, but also on timing, audience management, and adherence to ritual expectations. Any mistake could undermine authority, provoke unrest, or weaken the intended moral instruction. Execution was therefore as much about psychology and performance as it was about physical death. The societal impact of execution extended far beyond the immediate event. Empty scaffolds, abandoned wheels, and silent squares retained traces of past punishment, shaping communal behavior, reinforcing moral codes, and influencing collective memory. The faint smell of ash, the creak of timber, and the subtle rustle of wind carried a resonance that imbued the environment with moral and psychological significance. Even in the absence of witnesses, the memory of punishment endured, woven into the fabric of daily life, guiding behavior and belief. As morning light floods the town, one can imagine the roles converging, the condemned awaiting fate, the executioner poised with practiced precision, the silent assembly of spectators and clergy offering counsel. Each participant contributes to a multi-layered narrative in which life, death, obedience, and consequence intersect. Execution in the Middle Ages was not mere cruelty. It was a social, moral, and spiritual instrument, calibrated with precision to maintain order, teach lessons, and reinforce communal values. In reflective contemplation, the instruments and rituals of execution reveal themselves as meditative symbols. The wheel, rope, axe, and pyre are not merely tools of death. They carry layers of social, moral, and spiritual meaning. The rhythm of preparation, execution, and aftermath forms a slow, hypnotic cadence connecting generations. Shadows stretch across cobblestones, the stones retain impressions of countless footsteps, and the faint traces of smoke, wind, and whispered prayers linger, creating an immersive meditation on mortality, authority, and human experience. Even as the town awakens and life resumes, the echoes of law and punishment remain. Lessons of morality, obedience, and consequence encoded in ritual, memory, and architecture persist through centuries. They are reminders of human vulnerability, social structure, and the persistent desire to impose order and meaning upon the fragility of life. The Middle Ages, with their fear, ritual, hierarchy, and structured morality, form a rich tapestry of human experience, a rhythm that flows through history, guiding reflection, contemplation, and the quiet surrender to the cadence of the past. And as the sun rises fully, illuminating the town in its warm, golden light, one can sense the rhythm of centuries, the condemned, the executioner, the witnesses, and the silent stones, all part of an unbroken narrative. The lessons of mortality, obedience, and social order continue to whisper through time, guiding the imagination gently, drawing the mind into a deep, reflective state, and allowing history to cradle it softly into understanding, contemplation, and peace. Here, the Middle Ages reveal their profound lesson. Life, death, and morality are interwoven, and even in the harshest spectacles, there exists a pattern, a rhythm, and a reflection that transcends centuries, inviting the mind to rest, reflect, and drift gently into the quiet embrace of history,